All right, good evening. It looks like entries into the attendance have kind of slowed down, so we'll go ahead and get started. I hope everyone is doing all right out there. Most of our participants are from the state of Missouri, of course, and we are in a pretty serious deep freeze. Before we start, I just want to say that um, Ethan and I have no real internet. We have our computers hotspotted to our phones this evening. So hopefully the presentation that you see will not be glitchy because of that. If we lose everything, we will reschedule this webinar, but hopefully none of that will happen and we'll just go ahead and be able to proceed with no glitches. So just really briefly, so for all of you folks in the audience, we cannot see or hear you. So don't worry about that. If you want to communicate with us, please use the chat function or the Q&A. And just so you know, you can choose to have everyone that's attending see your chat, which is kind of fun, or you can send it just to us, the panelists. And we'll go ahead and take questions at the end after Zeb and Ethan have finished speaking, but feel free to put a question in anytime during the presentation. So for folks that haven't been with us before, my name is Dana. I'm one of the co-founders, along with Ethan, of the Missouri River Bird Observatory, and our mission is the conservation of birds and other wildlife and their habitats via science education and advocacy. So I always just like to tell folks, because people hear about these webinars from kind of a variety of different sources, but if you are interested in attending more, you can go to mrbo.org/events, and this is what it will come up. You can see that next week we're having a webinar on the Bird Safe Missouri effort that we are spearheading and St. Louis Audubon Society is spearheading, and you can come learn about how we and you can help save birds by having them not crash into windows. So that's going to be a good program. I also wanted to point out that on this page, if you click this little back button that I just highlighted with a red circle, you can actually see all of our webinars. We've done, I don't know, 40 or 50 now. There's some pretty cool ones, and the recordings are all up there, so you can find those. And to introduce my colleagues tonight, so Ethan is one of the co-founders of the Missouri River Bird Observatory. You can see him there. He is showing a bird to some kids in Columbia back when we did in-person events. And Zeb Yoko is our conservation science communicator, and they are going to speak to you about the waterfowl of Missouri this evening. So I hope everyone enjoys.
Yeah. Okay, so back in the day, I had a good time studying waterfowl in my undergrad, and it was really exciting because we just got to be immersed in it, and we had to know all the ducks, geese, and swans of North America, and it was kind of challenging. But once you figure out some key features, you can get to know them pretty well too. So today, I'm going to move some things out of the way here a little bit. We're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about ducks. Zeb's going to talk about geese and swans. And there's so much to learn about them. And I really wanted to point out like a couple resources that I think are real go-to resources. One of which is the Birds of the World by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Now, this requires a subscription, but if you're really, really into birds as a hobby, I think it's really worthwhile because it details a lot of things about them. And you can see down there below that there's just like tons of species submitted. There's lots of media out there. There's many authors, over 2,000 authors contributing to that. So that's a really good one. And then if you're not ready to bite the bullet on a subscription yet, you can go to All About Birds. And that really helps have cover more than just basics even. So that's a really good resource too. So I'd like to just sort of jump in and talk about kind of what to know, like duck ID. And it's important to know like systematics in the family tree and how that fits in. a little bit about behavior and habitat and shape. Those are things that are helpful to get to know ducks. Markings and color, but I'll show you some keys about this. So it can be very deceptive to try to go by markings and color. And a little bit about migratory behavior, but Zeb's going to be talking about that a bit more. And then the timing of that. So that's pretty important to know, and what ducks to expect to see and when. And I'll talk a little bit about duck conservation, managing for ducks, and various programs and things. But let's just jump right into systematics, and we'll geek out a little bit at first, and then maybe we'll go a little bit more fun stuff. But and then on a geek level, when we think about family trees of birds, I mean, you look at ducks and geese, and there's Anatidae, there's 54 genera and 174 species. So it's a pretty big group of birds. And there's some main branches involved with that really kind of helps with idea and concept. And back in the day, ornithologists came up with these kind of phylogenetic charts, family trees, how closely birds are related. And you can see there's an evolution here. That one on the right is kind of the more modern one. And the important thing to note here, that's Anatidae right there. That's Anatidae, that's the ducks. And then and Serene is down below that. So just keep that in mind when you're IDing birds, because it's good to have those helpful features in separating species out. But I'm going to jump right to the chase here. Look at that beautiful duck. And everybody knows that that's a mallard. Everybody, some people call them greenheads, I know. I mean, it's like the emblem for Ducks Unlimited and whatnot. But I mean, one key feature there to look at is that this beautiful speculum. Now, whether the duck is brown or drab, or it's a female or it's a male, whatever it is, ducks are often ID'd just by using this. If I took away that little white edge at the bottom there, and all you had was that blue speculum leading up to the top of the wing there, you could say that maybe that's a black duck. That's how closely related black ducks and mallards are, as well as mottled ducks. But we don't have many mottled ducks around here, and there's fewer and fewer black ducks. But still, that's kind of the telltale area to key in on, so to speak. Now, these have been used for a long time in wing ID. Here's an old can you see that all the way? This came from London. So these are British birds, but they're all the same ducks that we have pretty much. And this is how people forever have helped ID species, even when the rest of their plumage doesn't give it away. And even to this day, there's wing bees where people have competitions IDing ducks, and it's just with wings. That's all you got. And so that's how key that can be. Another great tool that I like to use is this Lemaster guide. And this Lemaster guide actually has these are life-size illustrations that show the bills. And you can see that variation in bills right there. That really helps tell you a lot about them. And so that's other than that, and keeping in mind kind of the migration time that Zeb's going to get into, let's just jump in right away to separating these ducks out into two different groups. A lot of people know this, but you want to sort of pay attention to their overall shape, their leg placement. If their leg placement is really far back, that's really ideal for swimming and diving ducks, but it makes them pretty awkward on land. And likewise, dabblers aren't really good in the water for diving in the water, that is. So here's a good illustration right here showing, we consider them diving ducks if they're down more than 13 inches. You see these dabblers like the mallards, they're real pretty big guys, and they're just like big bobbers sticking up there, and you see them tipping up and you see their butts up, and that's all you see them foraging. And then they're skimming that surface using the fine lamellae in their bills to help filter out those smaller things that they're eating. And then you get the smaller dabbling ducks, and they're even more extraordinaires at that. So let's just highlight a few of these dabblers right off the bat. I just wanted to show that picture right there of that lovely dabbler in the back. That's a northern shoveler. It's got a big shovel bill. So these shallow water foragers here, the main ones you're going to see in Missouri, these are going to be your common guys right there. Mallards, the teal group, northern shovelers, American widgeon, wood duck, gadwall. Those are going to be your main ones that you can put in that dabbler group. And here's some blue-winged teal on the private wetland. Notice you don't see the blue wings on them, but they do have that a nice disc color. They have that nice disc on the front that really helps show them. But you can see they're dabblers and they're really well camouflaged to be on that shoreline. They can be really hard to see. You can see a little shorebird in the front. It's a little bit more visible. You jump in these even smaller guys here, the green winged teal. Look at the difference between the male and the female. Again, when you see some brown female ducks out there, they're going to be very confusing unless you have a distinctive bill shape and you have another size comparison. It's going to be tough. So you're going to want to get a good look at that speculum or see who they're paired up with. There's another good look at that shoveler. I just love Amy Peterson's photo. This is called the glistening shoveler or something like that. And they're just a really common bird. That bright green head is usually really quite evident like a mallard, but people might confuse it unless you get a good look at that glistening bill. We got American widgeon here. That can be kind of confusing as well, but they do have some prominent head ornaments that help, and that bill color helps as well. Mark Ramsey is one of our favorite photographers in Missouri, and he provides these just amazing pictures of these wood ducks. And I don't think anybody's going to confuse a male wood duck for anything, but oftentimes the females, the squealers, get overlooked, and they might be confused with some other birds. But pay attention particularly to that eye ring and some of the other features, and maybe a little bit of their crest as well. Now, one of my favorite here is also the gadwall, and let's go back a second here. Yeah, okay. Let's dive into this gadwall a little bit. Now, these gadwall, you often see them tipping up, but they can go under a little bit further. And one of the key features diagnostic with them is that black butt. Like you often see that poking up, and that can help give away what the gadwall is, that and their vocalizations. But so that's the smattering right there. I'm just trying to get through those guys kind of quickly because they're all beautiful and wonderful, but there's just so many to look at. So let's dive into the divers a little bit to see some contrast, and look at this guy. They're more efficient. They have a sleeker build. They have that specialized bill with like real grippers down there, like teeth, real serrated bills to hold on to fish and other macroinvertebrates. And if you watch them out there and watch their behavior, they're pretty darn lazy compared to the dabblers. I mean, dabblers are working for it. They're constantly getting stuff. These guys, they just kind of loaf around and they're like, yeah, I'll just go grab this huge meal and then come back up and hang out and sleep for a while. They do a lot more loafing than a lot of the other birds once you examine their, what we call their activity budgets. But that's a sleek one. It's a good sleek diver. Unlike this guy here. Now, although these guys are seen in Missouri, this is a Barrow's goldeneye. I think one was seen actually quite recently. They're seen in Missouri, but this one you're going to see a little bit more frequently. This is the one on the right there is the common goldeneye. The one on the left is the Barrow's. And if you look real quickly, you can see that little difference on their face patch. You know, the Barrow's goldeneye's got more of this weird shape to it, where it's a little bit more round in the common goldeneye. There's some really great divers out there, and a lot of them we refer to as sea ducks. Actually, I mean, a lot of people think of Barrows, and they have an extraordinarily large range up north. And they can take advantage of those big open water habitats, unlike a lot of other birds can. But this is Bucephala albeola. It's named after Alexander the Great's horse. Isn't that weird? And so if you want to dump into some other beautiful sea ducks, here's another great one right here. This is the king eider. There's also spectacled eiders, and there's other great sea ducks out there. That we just don't get a chance to see very often in Missouri. But if you ever get a chance out there and you're in a pelagic system, go look for these ones. We had a wetland technician that worked for us a couple of years ago, and he's specializing in sea ducks now. He wants to be right up there between Alaska and Russia, just out there working on sea duck conservation. And I mean, look at these big, beautiful birds. It's quite compelling. So I don't blame him for wanting to do that. So we can't go over all of them because there's just so many and there's so little time. But I hope this gives you a good idea of kind of some of their differences, how to kind of split them out. But we covered those dabblers and those divers. But let's not leave out the odd duck. There's whistling ducks in Missouri, and there's two main whistling ducks that we get here in North America. They're the black-bellied whistling duck, which is this one here. Is that a duck or is that a goose? You know, I mean, it looks like somebody just chopped the duck in half and said, well, they chopped it in thirds, and I'll put the goose legs on it, and I'll put the goose head and neck on it, and then maybe make some ducks in the middle. But it is a duck. And their Latin name is Dendrosigna. So there's Dendrosigna autumnalis. And what they do is they love trees. So dendro meaning they like trees. And they're regularly seen in Missouri. There's a couple spots where like seem to be go-to spots in eastern Missouri regularly. So they do make different sounds as well. But those would be another one that would be throwing a curveball at you. And Zeb's going to cover all those geese coming up soon. But just don't ever look at that one and say, is that a Ross's goose? I mean, if you get to see that, you're pretty lucky, and it's a whistling duck. So what can we do about these birds? What can we do about duck conservation? Fortunately, we have a great history of duck conservation in North America. And a lot of it started out with just putting wood duck boxes out. Zeb's going to get a little bit more into kind of habitat requirements for waterfowl, but general stewardship, taking care of good habitat is really the key, and helping others that are taking care of good habitat. Clean water in your watersheds are just going to be more and more crucial as time goes on for us and for the ducks. Know what they need. You know that some ducks are going to need some of those bigger open waters. Know what they're going to need for that food habitat, cover. And know, especially in Missouri here, we don't have a lot of breeding ducks. But if you put up a box, you'll get wood ducks, and you'll get likely hooded mergansers and things. Especially, they're especially successful down at Duck Creek Conservation Area. They've had quite a few over the years, and a long-term study on them. So those are some simple, easy things to do for the breeding season. But the hardest thing is trying to do both. And so trying to provide good habitat and migration as well as breeding season. There's a lot of things you can do as far as recreational support. Like you can visit U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuges, which are sort of designed to be these great havens for migratory bird use. And give them support, join their friends groups and things like that. And then there's great conservation areas in Missouri that put a lot of work and effort into managing for waterfowl. And so I'd strongly suggest that, and then support those stewards out there, understand what they're going through, and maybe even buy a duck stamp, a federal duck stamp, whether or not you hunt. That also helps quite a bit. And join some organizations that help improve habitat, like Ducks Unlimited is a great one. I think there's Delta Waterfowl. There's other ones. So the organizations in general, it can fall in a couple categories. Like our Missouri agencies, we have the USDA and the NRCS that we work with quite closely. So at Merbo, we're out there counting ducks and all the birds using wetlands on 60, 80 sites a year. And 60 sites a year. And we've covered over 100 different sites, and we cover them twice, once in migration and once in breeding season. And here's a little map of a wetland that is, these wetland landowners took advantage of the resources to the USDA NRCS Wetland Reserve Program and helped design wetlands to help these birds out. And right here, we've got a smattering of these alpha codes. So there's Sora in there, Sora rails, there's blue-winged teal in there that we mentioned earlier, there's bitterns, there's northern shovelers. And we can take these maps and show the landowners and say, hey, this is working. These are where the birds are too. We can say these different components of your wetland are providing those habitats. So that the more public landowners know their habitat and know what they're using, they can keep continuing to provide better habitat for them. So that's our kind of detections and our maps. The Missouri Department of Conservation, I should have a thing coming up on. There it is. The Missouri Department of Conservation, the Missouri River Bird Observatory got a big start working at Grand Pass Conservation Area, monitoring birds in migration. We hung out these wetland managers all the time. And it's amazing that Grand Pass area right there, it's like 5,000 acres, a handful of guys is trying to manage all that with a ton of public pressure, mainly for hunting. And they understand all the habitat requirements, the needs of these birds, and then how to balance that with the public pressure of getting water on during hunting season and things like that. But it's pretty amazing to see what they've have gone through. We provide they provide harvest reports and things like that, and there's a lot of information on bird use of those public lands. But the public lands are about 5% of the wetlands in Missouri, something like that. The private wetlands are where it's at, so that's why we spend a lot of time on there, and we're so very thankful for the private wetland landowners that are out there. There's this year's report of our shortened study that we did a handful of sites this last spring, but we're ready to jump into it this spring, coming up in the spring and summer. There's a wide range of resources out there. Contact your local experts if you want to be able to do this on your land, or if and get to know your wetland if you do have a wetland, and if not, try to find ways to help out, because it's like the best habitat to be in watching these ducks. Wetlands are just, water is life, and they're just an amazing place to be. So that's my component there. I'm going to hand it on over to Zeb, and Zeb, hopefully I gave you plenty of time. And if you don't worry about stretching it out. If I went too short or whatnot, we can always do more Q&A.
That's right. I didn't time mine, so I don't know for sure, but I will have plenty to go off of. And I'm going to pick up right where Ethan left off. I'm going to share my screen here, get started, and with this first slide called Waterfowl World. Also a photo by Mark Ramsey, who has many photos that are going to be featured in my presentation. I also have some of my own photos because these wetlands are near and dear to us. We have done extensive research and study as an organization on wetlands. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to go tour private wetlands like these, and some of the public ones in our area as well. So I've taken many pictures as well, but then Mark Ramsey just has some of the best photos that we have access to and permission to use. And in particular, they're really good at showcasing these geese. Geese and swans, which I will be talking about today. I also wanted to make a note here before I get going too far that if you guys are new to our webinars, we've covered some of these things, at least scratched the surface or gone more in depth into the specific topics in previous webinars. So one of our first webinars, I think, was covering migration. So there's really in-depth migration news and facts on that one, but I'm going to get into a little bit of it here. And then more recently, we've talked about some of those programs that Ethan was mentioning about waterfowl conservation and how to enroll private land. We've talked about in our wetland webinars. We've talked about how those programs work and some of the other amazing birds you'll see on these highly productive habitats that are wetlands. Okay, so first thing I wanted to cover is, getting ahead of myself, is habitat patches and how migration is preserved through a mix of habitat. So waterfowl in particular require a mix of habitat. From our presentation so far, you've probably seen that these waterfowl require a diversity of habitat types, some deep water, some shallow water, some require trees, and then some, of course, grasslands as well. So water provides safety from some of the predators and foraging opportunities, while grassland provides more food sources and places to raise eggs. So most eggs cannot handle being submerged, so many things will put them on elevated grassy areas, or some things will float them, but I think most waterfowl tend to use elevated areas out of the water to make their nests. And then the grasslands also provide a food resource as well, in insects and other things, and some grains that waterfowl will eat. Waterfowl also used to frequent harvested ag fields to clean up waste grain that was incapable of being harvested, though these returns have diminished for the animals as machinery has gotten more efficient and farmers have been able to harvest more of their crop. So there's less waste grain available for waterfowl, which makes healthy wetlands and conservation and enrolling private lands in conservation even more important as a resource for migration. Okay, so Ethan said that I was going to be covering the geese, and he is correct. And I'm going to start with the first one of Canada goose, and I dubbed it an icon of the Mississippi flyway. So they are a very familiar bird, so I won't get into too much of the ID characteristics. But I also wanted to make a fun note that Missouri is home to the largest goose statue in Sumner, Missouri, and it's named Maxie. Actually, it looks kind of sad in this picture, and it's gotten a little bit worse over time, and so much so that they have started a GoFundMe or a fundraiser to help support restoration and try and repair our large goose icon that highlights how we are an iconic flyway area. And speaking of flyways, I'm going to get into the basically the nitty gritty of migration, or how migration works. So there are 4 waterfowl flyways in Missouri, or sorry, not in Missouri, in North America. We've got the Atlantic flyway in purple here on the right, the Mississippi flyway, which we are a part of, in yellow here, the Central flyway in orange, which is even more western central North America, and we do some of those birds will cross over in our area, and I'll get into that in a second. And then also the Pacific flyway in green here. So Canada geese are certainly a visible representation of this flyway. These large, you often see large V-shaped flocks honking loudly overhead during the day and sometimes at night, showing how active this route is. So I'm going to back up and explain what a flyway is. I've already named what they are and shown where they occur, but flyways are migration corridors, or long established routes birds use to migrate north and south as the seasons change. These have been deemed favorable by ancestors and typically avoid mountains to pass over, and have riverways, also called riparian corridors, that the birds will navigate along, that have favorable habitat for stopover and foraging and just kind of easier travel. So specific to the Mississippi flyway, the flyway that we are in Missouri, an Audubon source estimated that almost half of the bird species in North America use this flyway, and almost 40% of the waterfowl in North America spend part of their lives in this flyway as well. So Missouri is definitely in the Mississippi flyway, though we do also receive some birds from the Central flyway as they cross over. And actually, it depends who you ask what resource, where the delineation between Central and Mississippi flyway occurs. Some graphics show this all as Mississippi flyway here and kind of push the Central flyway a little bit further west. But one thing that's important to note is any birds that are in this area that do come over here are added to our numbers, and it leads to what I've heard in this area of northern Missouri, where the Missouri River flows through the state. It's been referred to as the golden triangle of waterfowl migration. So that's because there's lots of public land. We've got the intersection of 2 major corridors in the Mississippi River on our eastern shores, and then the western and the Missouri on the west that also cuts through the state, causing this kind of triangle-shaped funnel of migrants through our area. Okay, so back to Canada goose. I'm sure many of you, again, are familiar with the Canada goose, and for that matter, its reputation as being tough and feisty. So I said they're tough old birds here. One of my sources I regularly read for these webinars and e-newsletters said that they'll go so far as to attack things as large as an elk to defend their mate and their young. So that's huge. So for reference, Canada geese are only about 3.5 feet tall with a 5 to 6 foot wingspan, whereas elk can grow to 8 feet long and up over 1,000 pounds. So they're tough, and they want you to know that they are tough and loyal to their mate and raising their young. So they're really protective of their areas, and they try to be tough and showing off that. One neat thing about geese in particular is that they can digest grass. So they are often, of course, seen on lawns or manicured grasslands, and that's because they can digest grass. There are not many bird groups that can do that. Some ducks can do this, ostriches, and then some of the chicken-like birds such as grouse and turkeys have some capability of digesting grass, but it's a tough thing to really process. So not many birds do eat grass in particular. And many things will eat the grass grains, but like the actual growing leaves and grass, the geese are one of the few that can do that. So one of the reasons that they do favor lawns for this foraging behavior is that the short grass allows them to keep an eye out for predators, and then particularly when they're raising young, like you can see, there's a younger goose in the background here, like the one pictured here. Canada geese also can live for a very long time. They can live up to 33 years old, according to All About Birds, one of the sites that Ethan had mentioned earlier. Again, I will also corroborate those are fantastic resources and very helpful when you're learning about birds. And any sort of fact you want to get into, if they don't have it, they've got a primary literature source that shows it.
So Zeb, this makes me think that if you have a problem with too many geese pooping all over your property, maybe not having the short grass would help. Having longer grasses might help keep them off of it.
That is an interesting thought. And in fact, actually, I believe some airports have done studies that if we grow tall grass, we don't have to worry about as many geese collisions because they don't like growing into the tall grass.
Go away poop and go native.
There you go. Excellent segue to another webinar we have on habitat restoration and native plants. Again, so our events tab, if you go back in the past, you can see all of our previous webinars. Shameless promo again right there. And I think that's all I have for Canada geese. They are a very cool bird, but I'm going to get on to the next goose species, and that is snow goose. And these guys are exemplar migrants, is what I dubbed the slide here, because they have one of the most spectacular migration spectacles that you can see, you can witness. In Missouri and most of America, the only time we see these birds is during their migration. And so I'm going to show this animated map here, which I believe is also, this is from eBird data, which is also a Cornell project. And it shows active or relative abundance based on eBird detection. So when people submit a survey of birds that they've seen, the relative abundance is translated into this graph here. And I know it looks kind of wonky now, but once it plays, it should make a little more sense. So I'm going to pause it quick. Actually, right about now, I couldn't have done that if I tried. Late February, you can see the relative abundance is thousands of birds in these dark purple colors here, and they're actually in southern Nebraska and scattered throughout Missouri. So the color gradient, kind of like a heat map, shows with the darkest colors where the most birds are found. And then they are also seen in lesser numbers in the orange colored areas, actually down by the coast. And this is not a live map. I have no idea where they are dealing with the snow and the freezing cold that we have right now. But in general, in the past, this is where we see the birds at these times of year. So I'm going to keep progressing this, and you'll see as the season goes on, and by May, they're out of the continental US and they're up in the tundra. And then by September, October, they're on their way back. Oh, dang it. They're on their way back by September, October. I'll let it play again one more time to get there. So back to September, we see these birds funneling into the US and then again scattering in their wintering ranges, kind of in the central US. Wherever there's open water is going to be an important resource for them. So the lower Mississippi River is an important area. I forget what the regions in Kansas and Nebraska that they inhabit are called, but there are a couple areas. And then there are some that do head towards the coast. It looks like we've got some in California and then some on the East Coast as well.
So those animated range maps, you can find those yourselves for different species. They're just go search for Cornell's animated range maps for birds, and you'll find them. Seen a lot of geese bouncing around last week or so. Not as many snows, a few earlier. And last couple of days, I just hear Canada's like looking for open places to go.
Yeah, they're around. I'll put the link in the chat. I had just looked it up again actually earlier today. What these animated maps look like to make sure that I did mention that the Canada geese are in the Mississippi Flyway, but they do occur across all of them. And I double checked the maps to make sure of that, but there are a ton of them in the Mississippi Flyway. Okay, so snow geese, and then I'm going to go back to another migration fact. Waterfowl are perhaps the most obvious migratory birds, and one of the reasons is they have rather obvious timing cues. So These birds that breed all the way from the tundra, once it starts freezing and icing over, it's not going to be very good for them. So if the suddenly where you're hanging out, it starts to freeze over and you're now vulnerable to predators like these coyotes here, pictured here. So that tells you it's a really good time to start thinking about leaving. Waterfowl are also iconic for migration or indicative of migration because they often migrate by daylight in large flocks. And we just talked about, you can hear them and see them. Canada geese form the V-shaped flocks. Snow geese fly up way, way, way higher, and you can hear them chattering, and they're kind of more U-shaped, or just the number of birds is not a straight line. And then ducks are also in groups that fly like this. But smaller birds use these same corridors, but they'll just fly overnight, and then sometimes in smaller groups or just in quieter groups. They're just not as noticeable. So that's why I say that waterfowl are the most obvious, and they are a really good way of showing you guys have seen waterfowl and you see that they do move around, and that's just a really good example of migration. And as Ethan mentioned, you see them sometimes they do bounce back and forth a little bit north and south, not in the normal pattern where they'll bounce a little bit further north, even though it's winter time. If there's a new resource available or some reason, they do definitely oscillate.
Yeah, and the ducks that I covered there, when you look at the dabblers, of course the ice up is going to affect them first, and that's why they move first. And then those deeper divers, they can hang out longer because the open water is still available to them. So they pretty much follow the freeze.
Yep, and I would say the dabblers are the most definitely ones you see a lot of oscillation occurring. Was if there's a rain event and there's all of a sudden there's new water or anything that's recently flooded, they'll head back to that. So yeah. Definitely indicative of migration. Again, if you want to learn more about migration in particular and some of the major birds that do migration, check out our past webinars. Snow goose again. I'm kind of flitting back and forth here between things, but back to snow goose. They actually are one multimorph species now. Previously, the snow goose had been lumped into 3 separate species. You had the snow goose, I think was the snow goose was just the snow goose. It was white. It might have been the greater snow goose, and then they had a smaller snow goose, which was I think the western population out by California. There was a smaller subspecies, and then you also had this Ross's goose or blue goose. This is actually just a snow goose with a different color morph. So they are
So
all.
I think I always thought that the Rosses were the smaller ones.
Maybe that's I
Yeah.
didn't do my research on which ones were which. I just know that there's 3 subspecies that are combined into one species now, and they all refer to
Wow.
them.
So Rosses are still considered a snow goose. I didn't
As far
know
as
that.
I know.
Huh.
Yeah, so they used to be separated by this color morph and size, but now they just all get lumped into snow goose. And one of the things that's really interesting, and I talked about it when I talk about why these are iconic of migration, is they migrate through Missouri by the millions. They will move through, I think Los Bluffs is one of the easiest places to see this spectacle, and actually all along I-29, all along the Missouri River there, you can just see hundreds of thousands, millions of birds. They'll be funneling in or out of the water, or this kind of taking their time trying to decide if they want to land there or what they're going to do or head out to a field. But they are just millions of birds, millions of snow geese will come through Missouri every spring and fall. And some of them will stay here throughout the winter. But none of them stay here for breeding. They all head up to the tundra for that stage. And then another tundra species, and the last goose species I'm going to cover, I did just stick to the ones in North America for time's sake and for my knowledge sake. And that is going to be the greater white-fronted goose. And you actually should see there are 2 different species in here. We've got our Canada goose again, and the greater white-fronted goose are the majority of these here, pictured here. But they do tend to occur in mixed flocks, or at least gather in mixed flocks at their stopover sites. So their orange beaks and orange legs differentiate them from the Canada geese seen here in this picture. But in this next picture, they're mixed in with ducks and swans. I find the greater white-fronted geese, or speckle-belly geese is another name they have, often get confused with ducks easily due to their size, their mixed flock tendencies, and their colors. I mean, they've got bright orange legs, bright orange beak, much like the other ducks. And they're really not, they're a little bit larger and their posture is a little bit different than ducks, but they're not dramatically different. However, the things that you can key in on are The white part right in front of the white fronted area that they get their name from, and their orange beak and their orange legs, and then their black streaks on their belly can be something that you can key in on. But also the sounds that they make. They don't make the typical quacking of ducks. And so I'm going to try and play this back here. Hopefully it plays through. So hopefully that came through as kind of a cackling or kind of a laughing, they call it sometimes. So it's a lot higher pitch than the quack of a duck. So if they're in a group, you'll hear them as a way to differentiate and know that they are there. Oldest greater white-fronted goose that's been on record is 25 years old. So it's amazing how long-lived some of these waterfowl species can be. Here again, they are in the greater white-fronted goose is in with a mixed flock. One ID note that I found helpful for differentiating the greater white-fronted goose again is actually these white semicircles on their tails when flushing or flying away from you. And then that namesake white ring around their face, you can see some of in here, I think. Yeah, so you can see a little bit back there. That namesake white, it's unique for most other duck species. The only one with a similar pattern that Ethan showed is that blue-winged teal, and those are much smaller. Some of those divers I know have that white spot too, but they're also much smaller, and they shouldn't be confused as much as some of the other ones like the mallards or canvasbacks or things that you might see them mixed in with. It's also worth noting that these mixed flocks, it only occurs in Missouri and migration areas because there's not really a territory defined when you're migrating. It's just kind of the strength and numbers of flocking and the limited availability of quality stopover sites are why all these birds will condense into the same place. All right, so next two species I've got are trumpeter swans, and tundra swan are the other ones. So the two swan species are all I've got left. Trumpeter swans are a massive conservation success story. They are the largest waterfowl in North America, and their fantastic conservation story stems from having rebounded from just over 100 birds, somewhere between 100 and 300 estimated in the last century, so in the early 1900s. But through legal protection from hunting, conservation protections, and restoration of habitat important to the species, they've made a huge increase in numbers to the point where you can see hundreds altogether on the same refuge. There were counts of 300 or more on Swan Lake this year, and they've been in Los Bluffs, and even I think it was 600. I think they broke a record this year for the number of swans they saw on the refuge. So a recent estimate of the population sets the population around 63,000 birds, which is phenomenal. Again, so I don't feel like I need to go too much into the ID traits. You've got the large white body with the large black bill for these, and they are the largest waterfowl. The next one is the tundra swan, which is smaller yet elegant, and it's very similar to the trumpeter swan in the size and in the shape and general coloration scheme. But one thing you can maybe see here is this yellow spot right below their eye. So these are tundra swans here. And I've got a graphic that Ethan sent me that really can help point out and differentiate between the swans and geese for that matter. So the trumpeter swan, they just have a huge beak and bill, and it extends further back into the eye. It's just kind of their whole face is this black mask. Whereas the tundra swan is smaller, and it has this yellow marking on the lower. And I will just briefly, very briefly right now, cover the mute swan is another species that is seen in Missouri. They're not really native, and they're kind of jerk to the other species, and they're not really in my area, fortunately, so I don't cover them too much. But they have this knob on their forehead and then an orange beak. So if you do see a swan that looks weird and has an orange beak, it's not going to be one of the native trumpeter or tundra swans. And then again, for comparison,
and if you see them,
go ahead, Ethan.
I was just saying, if you see those mutes, if you see a bird being really aggressive out there, looks like a swan that's being aggressive to all the native species, it's likely that one. And so, yeah, if we have any strong advocates and people that are big fans of those mean swans, we'll mute you. Just saying.
Never escape from the puns from Ethan. So lastly, again, so comparison with the snow goose, they have this pink bill, and then they've got this grin patch is what they call it here. And you can see the head shape is different, and they're much smaller than the swans. But the size thing is a really convenient way to identify between trumpeter and tundra, because this is a really hard thing to spot. It doesn't always show up in your binoculars, and it can be really faint, or if you get the right, the reflection off of water, it's really hard to tell. But if you see them in a mixed flock, you can definitely tell the tundra swan from the trumpeter swan, and you'll have to excuse my blurry picture through my binoculars trying to capture this good reference here. But you've got a tundra swan in the front here, and they do have the long neck, so it must have its neck tucked away here. You can kind of see that it does, but being a bird in the front of a picture, it should be much larger if it is the same size. So you can see that it is just a lot smaller than the trumpeter swans that it was mixed in with. I think I only saw one when I was taking this picture, just the one tundra swan in comparison to these much larger trumpeter swans.
Where was that photo, Zeb?
This photo was from Swan Lake Refuge. So I think I only had, I was doing a countdown there, and I only had the one tundra swan, I think, the entire time. But it's really hard to see for sure. And if they flush away, I mean, unless you can hear some, I think there is a sound difference if you hear them flush up. You can hear the vocalizations are a good way to note the difference as well. But sometimes you don't get to hear that. So sometimes size, and then really cueing in on specific ID traits. I think that's a really good kind of take-home message from the waterfowl webinar, is there are really key places to look at waterfowl for ID differentiation. And with that, that's all I've got. I think we did pretty good on time. I think I talked quite a bit though.
Yeah, it gives us
So
time to clarify the Ross's goose a little bit.
Time for questions.
So the snow geese, I think they used to think that the blues and the regular snow geese were a different species, and now they've determined they're the same. But there's also the Rosses, which is a bunch smaller. So I think that's still a separate species.
Okay.
And
One-
I'm not
one
sure
second.
about the California ones though.
One
Yeah.
second. So when I'm not talking, I get to look things up.
Excellent.
So I have links and other things as well to show, but yes, Rosses are almost always smaller, up to 40%. I did see something from the Kentucky Ornithological Society that says that size really isn't actually the best diagnostic to differentiate between snow and Rosses, and that it can be, the way the article was written, it wasn't just the usual size thing where it can be a little deceiving. It says that it just simply isn't always so. Plus, there's a lot of discussion of hybrids. So one interesting thing I found was an article written by David Allen Sibley just last year, 2020, with a discussion of morphology of Rosses and snow geese, and then his opinion on one actually being a hybrid between the two. So I just thought that that was all very interesting, and I will place that link into the chat.
Excellent. Yes, feel
I think
free
Dana,
to
Dana
ask
has an
questions.
answer for a question about, she has an answer for a question about hunting flooded timber and opportunities to do that in Missouri. And I certainly can understand the desire to be in flooded timber, because that's a pretty awesome habitat to be in. And I know Arkansas has a lot of that. But as far as trying to find public ground, I think Dana will come up with got something.
I did, yes, and I'll actually, let's see if I can pull this up. I'll share screen, because this was simply the easiest way that I could find to really go about navigating the answer to the question about hunting in flooded timber. I assume you all can see that. Okay, so this is just on the MDC website, and again, I'll put this link in the chat as well. But you can see if you scroll down, this will link you to some good locations, and for the conservation areas, there are always maps available that actually tell you exactly where and in what proportion the different habitat types are. So Ethan mentioned Grand Pass earlier. While flooded timber is certainly not the majority of habitat at Grand Pass, it does exist there, just as an example. The other thing I found when looking about flooded timber hunts is that if one so desires to go this route, there are a lot of different outfitters that will take folks out on both public and private land as well. So all of the wetland areas that I've been on have at least some proportion of flooded timber.
Yeah, it's just a matter of finding if they have blinds in that flooded timber or not. And if you're not afraid to travel across the state, it might be a little bit easier. But then again, if you talk to a regional person on that NBC website, you can find your regional people and ask them, say, hey, I know these might be open hunting areas. They don't have a draw or nothing you can go into. And there might be some little smaller conservation areas out of the way that have good flooded timber that don't get the pressure and don't get the notoriety, but the local knowledge will be there with the local conservation people.
I also wanted to show something that the second question after that one regarding potential hunting areas was a question about Western Missouri and what flyway it was in. And in the context of another project, I had to look very much into flyways and how they're designated. And it honestly kind of depends on the source. So just like anything with biogeography and particularly with migrating birds, there is absolutely no one size fits all. So these are just a couple of examples of flyway maps. You can see that in the one on the left, it's rather arbitrarily designated just by state boundaries, right? And birds don't follow state boundaries. You can see there on the one on the right, here's sort of the main Mississippi Valley. You can see it goes up to the Mackenzie Valley and the Arctic, Great Lakes, Mississippi Valley. But so this is like the main Mississippi Valley flyway, but you can see basically birds are getting to the Missouri River and taking a left, essentially on their way up north. And so then this then sort of blends into the central flyway at that point. So Krista, in answer to your question, it really kind of depends on what map you look at, but you can see, I mean, I find this to be pretty biologically accurate, that map on the right hand side.
And by overall lumping them together, when you get to individual species, it's going to be a little bit different. Dana and I were at a conference where they showed us the eBird data that they put together along with radar data and other sources. And it was just amazing. That's an old one. That's the old one right there. That's from
This
back
is a
in the
new
day.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service report. They still use that graphic at the front of it.
That's a
actually
beauty.
harvest data from this year.
That's good old art there.
Yeah,
not
yeah.
exactly,
So I thought, I was like, that's got to be an old map. I was like, oh no, this is the new report. So yeah,
with the new,
I just want to echo that.
with the new data that came out though, like it actually looks like for a lot of our pasturing birds, the actual true Mississippi central, or the central flyway, is in western Missouri and a little bit of eastern Kansas, like on that borderline there. It seems to be a major concentration area.
And I think a lot of it too, for the waterfowl, because so many of them use this area, a lot of them stop on the coast, the Gulf Coast. So like even in the Central Flyway and the Mississippi Flyway. So they're going to intermingle there. So it does really get confusing how you define which is which going forward.
Any tips for IDing black ducks? Flooded timber. If they're in flooded timber, it's a good chance of them. When you see them flying away, it's going to be like kind of black and white flashes under wing above, they kind of flash like that. And it's really looking at that speculum. And you might actually find some, in betweens. But there's any white at all on that speculum, it won't be counted. But if it looks like a mallard and doesn't have any white on the speculum, on that lower part of the speculum, then it's a black duck. Otherwise, they're about the same.
Do the black ducks, the males, have a green head too?
No. No. Nope. I don't
So
think so.
they're just really hard to differentiate from the hen mallards,
Females.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think they do. Yeah.
I don't think so either, but I don't
Yeah.
know that I've ever seen one, so I don't have a field, lock on it.
I don't remember seeing one that said, "Hey, that's the male black duck." I'd be like, "Hey, that's." We were up in the valley of the St. Lawrence Valley, and there was a good pile of them up there, and I don't remember seeing them. But they're flooded timber. That's the bottomland forest habitat is really on the decline. We've less than 12% of that remaining, so that's why we don't see as many black ducks anymore. Yeah. Are there areas, wetlands close to Columbia for spring migration? Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area is like one of the best. People just love that conservation area, particularly for waterfowl. I think just on the other side of
Shorebirds as well, but yeah.
Yeah, and rails. Yeah, we do rail walks in there. Just south of the river there is Plowboy Bend, which is a little lesser known one. You can get around the river, get down in there. I'm not sure what their wetland situation is like, but it's right there as well in the floodplain. And get on that MDC site and check it out for public lands, and then you'll likely find some good sources. And nearby Eagle Bluffs, there's like a water treatment plant nearby where people have like for years have spotted like Virginia rail in there or something. So keep your eyes open in random spots. And then I think there's some areas associated with the university too, on where their School of Natural Resources has some studies and stuff. Yep, and check out eBird. Just go to eBird and look for hotspots around Columbia and see which ones are wetlands. It'd help too.
Swan Lake's not too far of a hike, but it's a bit of a ways. It's about 2 hours. I just had to map it. And then Grand Pass, when you guys are talking about too, that's not terribly far, right? Am I crazy off?
Yeah.
It depends on how far you define as far, I guess, of course.
If you want within half an hour, it'd be Eagle Bluffs, but
yeah.
I
guess I just wanted to advocate the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuges are not necessarily show up on the MDC site because they're federal land, but they are also a good waterfowl resource. Big Muddy is based in Columbia, but I don't know that they have any good viewing areas in there for waterfowl or wetlands.
No, I wouldn't think so. And a lot of them are going to be frozen up right now.
Right.
Yeah, these wetlands are going to be iced over, but all throughout the state, don't overlook state parks. Now, Pershing State Park is like a great one for wetlands. They've got perennial wet habitat. Get an area map when you're there, and find the cool areas. There's some neat little nooks around there, that kind of off the beaten path, as well as good boardwalks for experiencing that wetland habitat. So the MDC's website will have a good atlas. State park should have good resources to find them throughout the state as well. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, and if you're in northeast part of the state, you go to Clarence Cannon. Yep. If you're in the northwest part of the state, you go to Los Bluffs. And if you're in the central, you go to Swan Lake. And if you're down there in the Boot Heel, make sure you get to Mingo. That's another incredible wetland destination, thanks to the refuge system.
I think that answers the question of best public areas too. So that should cover that, and we'll provide the links in I think we put the links in the chat. We'll put them on the webinar page saying like these are the places to look for waterfowl habitat. We have reached 6:30, but I think we'll keep going for a couple more questions. But if anybody needs to leave, just make sure.
We'll get them a follow-up email.
Yep.
I'm sorry, guys. I've been trying to put links in the chat and answering a few things by typing into the Q&A. Did anyone mention like Swan Lake and Fountain Grove? I heard Eth mention Pershing. Okay, great.
Fountain Grove is right there. It's put in the same category as Grand Pass. In fact, it has the same kind of experienced managers that have been under the same tutelage and system for a long time. So they're really just incredible wetland experts that manage those areas that are somewhat proximate. And one, I see somebody asked, did I read that snow geese are overpopulating, creating problems on the tundra? Yes. And so the main underlying hypothesis is that there's been such an abundance of kind of agricultural grains on their wintering grounds, rice fields and things like that, that they actually have a much higher than normal kind of winter survival. And that's creating a lot of overpopulation on the grounds. And so they're overeating their resources, which don't grow nearly as quickly as they do in the southern latitudes. So by all accounts, yes. So that's why they have an unlimited bag limit on the snow geese.
During the conservation season. I don't think during normal season they have that.
I don't think it's, there's
just
migratory birds, to clarify, migratory birds have a whole separate set of regs.
That definitely tells you it is a ecological concern if a conservation season is open season for them when they have their specific season with no limits. That means they're a problem species somewhere else in the line. So, but yeah, make sure you check all your regs if you were going to partake in any hunting activities.
Just quickly going back to the first question about managed flooded timber, and I just mentioned that a Google of that for Missouri brought up a lot of outfitters. For folks that might be beginning hunters, it can be really good to get a guide and go with a guide the first time, because of all of these things that you all were just talking about. There are a lot of different regulations, and they seem like, I do not hunt myself, I fish, but Ethan hunts and Zeb hunts, and like clearly you can get to know them, right? You guys do, but some people prefer to just learn from somebody else. And one of the articles that I posted there in the chat does suggest even like finding a mentor to learn from. So
yeah, local Ducks Unlimited chapters probably have quite a few people that be willing to help out with that. There's a lot of those chapters around.
Yep.
What rivers are they following other than flyways? Dana might want to jump on this one, but oftentimes birds are using a lot of different other cues, whether it's mountain ranges or other landscape indicators. Some birds are known to follow now interstates. So it has a lot to do with other factors of the landscape they have to contend with and that are good landmarks.
That is pretty much what I would have said, because there are, the Appalachians, the Rockies, the coasts, of course. So it's not always just rivers, although, the Mississippi and Missouri are big rivers and therefore really important landmarks.
The cool thing about it is we don't know all the answers, and it was just a few years ago that they figured out that all these, they found out, like, where do they go in the winter? We can't find them. They're like way off the coast of Alaska in the frozen waters, and they would all be out there, like the whole population be in a couple big pods, and they would just keep that water open by the movement of their bodies so they could keep diving and foraging. But everybody's like, they found them in a flyover. They're just like, in a plane. They said, hey, look at that. So there's still a lot that I think we can still learn about their flyways, their migratory behaviors.
And they do change. The species themselves do adapt as well.
Some can.
We have a few different comments that have only gone to us that would be good to share with the group. Riverlands Migratory Bird Sanctuary over by St. Louis is a great place. So Ryan says it's a great place to see trumpeter swans and many other species of waterfowl. Margie mentions that Long Branch Conservation Area is another really good place for waterfowl as well.
If areas that look like they're closed, pay closely attention to their regs on that. If they're closed for hunting, they might be closed for only certain times. And I know that a lot of these conservation areas that have hunting will also just really shut down a whole area just so that the birds have refuge from people completely. So but I'd pay attention to those regs and see when their opening times are. And you know, it's going to be a little bit of teal season in October, and then there's going to be a little bit of later waterfowl season, and it's kind of a window there. And if you can avoid that window or navigate that, you'll be in good shape for your photography and non-consumptive use.
Also, state parks as well. I guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but occasionally they'll do like managed youth deer hunts on state parks, but typically there is no hunting on state parks. Am I correct?
That sounds right.
That sounds right to me too.
So Krista, for photography, it would be to my knowledge, it would be a very unusual situation for there to be any hunting in a state park. So you wouldn't have to worry about watching the daily regs and how those change.
Cackling geese. Oh
Are
my
cute.
god.
Cackling.
They are cute, but I mean, they are really tough. Unless you see this whole flock that's like all like pretty close, it's hard to see them. But it's a size thing. The cackling's just going to be a little smaller, but that I'd have to look at All About Birds to see if there's any other diagnostics that I can come up with, or if their vocals are any different. Their vocalizations are different as well. But I mean, if you're not right up on them, it's going to be tough. There used to be 13 subspecies of Canada geese, ranging from the Hawaiian to the giant. So we don't have quite the diversity, but there still is a diversity of Canadas out there, and they can be tough.
We won't get into the species concept of which ones, when they're subspecies or when they are species again, because I think cackling has been lumped in the past, I think, but I don't know for sure, and I don't want to open that can of worms again, but there definitely is a noticeable group of cackling.
I'm looking at it right now, and until 2004, they were considered one species.
Okay.
And now, due to genetic research, the cackling goose is on its own with 4 subspecies of its own. So there you have it.
There you go.
What is that, Hutchinsoni or something like that? I don't remember.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Branta Hutchinsoni, or however you say it.
Yep.
You Latinize the name.
So somebody's asking about snow geese, and if they do the eruptive thing. The drivers behind the eruptive migrants of our pine siskins and what else, like red-breasted nuthatches, and those guys that really concentrate on boreal systems where the fluctuation in mass production of the seeds really affects them. And so they in hard years, hard winters, when there's not a lot of seed production, they have to move out. Where in these primitive, much more primitive birds, the geese, their drive is much more, and their migratory drive is much more innate within them, to just know to go. And the main key driver for them is that ice over. And their other biological imperative, rather than just a yearly need for food. They're going to need it every year. They're going to need to migrate.
Yeah, so I guess I'll kind of dumb that down. So for the pine siskins, it's like if they need to leave, they will. Whereas snow geese, they always leave the tundra every year. So that when we get an eruption, it's only one more of them.
I wonder though, that question makes me think if there's some localized effect of that, like, is there some years where they're going to be down in Arkansas and they're not going to be spending much time in Missouri, like in this kind of cold snap. So there might be kind of a localized eruptive movements. I don't know what you call that, meta migration or whatnot, but there might be more of that.
I would say talk to any waterfowl hunter and they will definitely tell you things change every year. So to add to that.
I was talking to a guide a couple of years ago, and he was one of those outfitters that follows the whole goose migration, follows them all the way up from up north, all the way down south, and follow. And it's something.
You've got some serious bird
Okay, there we
numbers.
go. So, Eth, can you mute?
Yep.
Thanks. Again, I'm not always sure what all the attendees can see, so I think we're just seeing some of these things. So I want to read the comments. So the Missouri Bird Records Committee issued a concern about cackling geese being misidentified. Bill size is key. So that's thank you for that comment. And eBird has issued something similar. This attendee says, I've noticed a lot of smaller geese this winter that are just smaller Canada, not cackling. And so we're just talking about like all the different subspecies. So that's, I think, just like a really important comment and a good distinction to make, because there is a lot of inherent diversity in these. So if, the cackling itself has 4 subspecies, and that's, across the continent. But in looking at Audubon, there's also lesser Canada, and Ethan mentioned the diversity in subspecies, and the largest Canada goose can weigh twice as much as a cackling goose. So, but there's a lot of variation in that spectrum. So thank you for that comment about bill size being key. We have one question in the chat. Identifying females, identifying hens. Do they often hang near the males? Thanks, Sarah, for asking that. And
That's one of the, we're talking about geese or ducks?
Ducks, I believe. Yep.
Well, that's
ducks.
one of the,
Yep.
that's one of the cool things about waterfowl, is that here in Missouri we get to see them pairing up. Other birds that winter here, they don't pair up here. They wait to go back to the breeding grounds to do that. So oftentimes they will be together. So it really helps with figuring out what species they are when you have a bright, gaudy male right there with a more subtle, attractive plumage of the female.
And I'll comment too on that it's easier to ID in the spring when the males are for sure in their full breeding plumage, whereas the eclipse plumage, some of the males will kind of look somewhere between a male and a female because they have more drab feathers. They don't have the bright colors because it's a little bit more advantageous to be hidden, or the feathers have gotten worn down.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. It's something different about their molt patterns are definitely, because of that cycle, is different than a lot of our passerines. And that's why in the summertime, they'll go through what they call an eclipse plumage, and they'll lose all of their flight feathers at once. So they can, they'll be able to swim away and whatnots, but they're basically flightless for a little bit, which other birds don't dare to do. That's why there's a lot of geese roundups and things like that for banding operations at that time. Easier to capture.
Speaking of banding, Ryan from St. Louis, because I know we have 2 Ryans on here, or at least 2, mentions that they had a neck-collared trumpeter swan show up last week at Riverlands that was collared on September 8th, 2003 in Wisconsin. Yellow neck collar 06A. So that's pretty cool. And Zeb and Ethan showed a number of pictures from Mark Ramsey, who is a photographer in our area. And he every year had photographed a neck collared swan for many years. And he and we are sad because he hasn't been seen this year, which, I mean, it could be okay, but Mark somehow has found him in his area up by Salisbury and surrounds every year for I think 8 or 9 years, and the bird is, I believe, 12-ish. So that's pretty neat. It's a cool thing to be able to see a neck collared bird, and it's one of the rare banded bird situations where you can actually, see the band and ID the bird from it with the records. So
you keep your eyes open when you see those flocks and see if they carry those bands. It's interesting that they keep popping up from same general areas where they did a lot of work and reconstruction, reintroduction, or captive. How'd they do that? They oversaw the regrowth of these populations. I think Seney was one of the places. Seney National Wildlife Refuge was a big one for that. I'm trying to figure out where else, but it's amazing how they're able to make a difference there. You were saying earlier, a couple hundred birds, and now you're seeing a bunch of them.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So guys, we are out of questions and past time, so we can let people go. But for folks that are still on, thanks for sticking with us, and everyone will get a follow-up email, and we'll put a number of different links, some of which were in the chat, but we'll put more. So
thanks for the great questions and helping us think.
Yeah, that was
through
cool.
these things, and keep warm, everybody.
Yeah.
Indeed. Thanks, Patrice. I know I think you're in California, and I'm super jealous right now. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you
Thanks,
very
everyone.
much.